Bacteria have been blamed for causing disease for over 150 years. But is this theory or proven fact? Here is a compelling new explanation. It's only a half truth that bacteria are the cause of disease, and here's why. It's the activity and putrefied waste product of bacteria that actually makes you feel sick, but they're not the causative agent of the temporarily altered tissue. In fact, they're repairing the tissue. They are the restorative agent returning your body to homeostasis. Bacteria aren't harming you, they're actually helping you. They're restoring you back to the way you were before you experienced a disruptive life situation. Nobody has ever been able to transmit bacteria from a sick person to a healthy person via normal transmission vectors to make them sick. Bacteria, a radical take on bacteria. How you going, Brad?
Bravo. Never better, Matt. How about yourself?
Really well. Really
Awesome.
happy to do a nice, interesting intro like that to start us off.
Yeah, that sounded great. That's a nice, tight script there. Really enjoyed it. Well done.
So you're going to be taking us through a radical take on bacteria, letting us know all the information that you've gained over the years, and teaching us
Yes.
maybe what we don't know about bacteria. Is that right?
I think so. And it'll make I'm going to do a little bit of historical background just to understand how we got to where we got, and we'll let the listener, you know, wonder and surmise what could be inaccurate or accurate about what I said. But I think by the end of this, we're going to find out that there's a lot of fishy stuff going on in the realm of infectious disease and germ theory. So we'll see if I can provide a convincing podcast in that regard today.
Okay. Well, I'm ready. Lay it on us.
All right. Well, I'm going to start. We're going to do some historical figures here. And I'm going to go back to your favorite guy who you enjoyed hearing about, Louis Pasteur. He is well known as the father of germ theory. Wasn't the first one to think of germs, or he wasn't the first guy to develop a vaccine. There were others ahead of him, but he's considered the one that really broke it wide open and made it mainstream. So he lived 1822 to 1895. He was a chemist by training, in case anybody wondered. And his professors described him as mediocre chemist at best. And today, of course, we have 37 infectious institutes around the world named after him. So he, in any textbook you look at, whether college or high school, they're always going to talk about Pasteur. He's kind of, when you think of medicine, you think of Pasteur. And of course, most of us are familiar with the pasteurization of milk and other dairy products to allegedly kill harmful bacteria. Of course, there's a lot of raw milk fans out there that love to get their hands on it when they can. Most of the state statutes have banned this, certainly here in the United States. So it's hard to come by. But interesting that people would be interested in that if, in fact, milk was filled with harmful bacteria, huh?
Mm-hmm.
So, his idea was that, he came to this conclusion that disease was caused by what he called the germs of the air. And he kind of came around to this. He was studying fermentation was big back in his period in France, which is where he's from, of course. And so they were studying ways to, ferment wine and beer and so forth. And that was kind of how he got into this. That's where the money was, basically. And he, of course, slowly moved into areas like anthrax and rabies, which he's known for. Those are the two big things that he's known for. And I already went through those in the virus talk. So we won't go into any of those details here today. This is the virus podcast. But what's important to note is that neither he nor anybody else could visualize, find, or see this thing they called a virus. It was speculation, right? They had seen with people who had infections or diseases, they had seen the bacteria, which they could see with their light microscope. They assumed that the bacteria were the cause of the problem. And when they couldn't find bacteria, but found infections and disease, they assumed that there was something smaller that they couldn't see that was causing the problem. That makes sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just
So
a classic kind of physics approach, right? Like we observe something that we don't understand, so it must be something very small that we don't know about. It's kind of in physics as well, right?
reductionist approach, right? That's probably a good word for it. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's exactly what they were saying. And to be fair, it wasn't a ridiculous, terrible idea. It made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so at any rate, he's the guy that is well known for the anthrax. And he wrote, I had a private diary, and he told his family never to publish it or let anyone see it. But his great grandson actually released it in the late 1980s, I think. And a Princeton professor published a book of his private diaries, and they were just chock full of fraud, immoral, and unethical practices. And the professor did everything his best to keep Pasteur looking good despite that. So it was almost like, well, these were just some things he sort of did once or twice, but otherwise he was still a great man. That was kind of the tenor of the book. But if you step back away from it a little bit and get a sense of what he was doing, you'll see that he was always trying to, whatever fraud or plagiarism he could commit to make himself a bigger celebrity, more powerful and more popular, is what he did. So that's
All
pretty
right.
much
Charming.
I can sum up Pasteur and just say what he basically did with everything, his anthrax, his rabies, everything else he did, is he literally ground up puppy and bunny brains, spinal cords, put them in a blender, ground them up, and took the fluids out of here and attenuated them back through living animals like bunnies, which meant he basically squirted his vaccines into them, ran it, and then took their blood out, said it was attenuated. And these are the basis of his rabies and anthrax vaccines, as I call them. That's what Louis Pasteur
Right.
did.
Genius.
Yep. And I'm not, it's about as simple as that. That's what I'll say. To think that there was some magical, powerful medical, biological, scientific backing from his work, you would be incorrect to think that, even though that's how it's portrayed in the textbooks. So that's Pasteur.
Okay. So that's our first development. And then we have, is it Koch? Robert Koch or Cook?
Koch or Koch, depends on, I think correctly said it's Robert Koch, but most people say Koch today, Koch.
Yeah,
He was a
just less
contemporary.
awkward, isn't it?
It's much less awkward. Contemporary of Pasteur, same time period. He's in Germany, of course, and this is where the other action was going in this world. And he was, he's kind of credited with being one of the founders of medical bacteriology. And he, considered the father of microbiology, along with Pasteur, by the way. So he's credited with finding the tuberculosis mycobacterium. And, immediately, again, not a terrible assumption to make, but he found this little bacteria in the blood and sputum and so forth and lungs of people that had or dying of tuberculosis or consumption. So the assumption was made, this little squiggly creature is the cause of this disease. And he also is credited with discovering cholera, and and anthrax. So he's in that mix as well, along with Pasteur on the anthrax thing. And again, they're finding these animals and people that are sick, and they're finding this little bacteria thing in there, actively in the fluids, the tissues of the sick person. So what's important to note is this, if you go back and look at this, and Mike Stone on the virology website just did a great critique on the whole cholera thing. So he basically got the whole history down on it. And it's just one failure after another, just like you'll hear as we keep going on proving that these little bacteria are the cause of disease. They find a lot of people that had cholera, but they couldn't find the bacteria. And then they found other people who didn't have cholera, but they had the bacteria. And there's all kinds of this in the mix. And of course, then they have people who had cholera who had the bacteria. Well, they tried to take that bacteria out and give it to healthy people. As immoral as that might sound, right, or unethical, this is what Pasteur was doing, this is what Koch was doing. All the contemporaries were happily getting volunteers or prisoners or whomever as human subjects to try to take these bacteria. And whatever they did, they could not make these people sick. That's the astonishing thing. So this, of course, brings us to Koch's postulates, and this is something I mentioned in the virus podcast. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here again. But the same idea here is that Koch's postulates were take the thing, purify it from the sick person, give it to the healthy person, Healthy person gets the same disease, take that, and then get that thing that you think were causing it out of a healthy person again and purify it. That's Koch's postulates.
Hmm.
So they've never, ever, ever been proven to this day. I mean, to me, that should just knock you out of your seat. That there is no scientific study, not one, let alone one that's been repeated, that shows how you can take bacteria and give it to healthy subjects and make them sick. So this is what he's famous for today, obviously, these postulates. And they've been modified. There's now Rivers postulates, which aren't quite as stringent, but they still can't prove Rivers postulates today. And it's quite a thing that this deception has been able to go on for as long as it has, when you just simply look back at the evidence and see that they could not prove this germ theory, this infection thing. So that's Koch. I made a few notes here about a couple of guys, the Rosenau Spanish flu experiments in 1918, hundreds of volunteers. They were trying everything you can imagine under the sun, taking the snot, mucus, saliva, and, getting sick people to cough and sneeze on healthy people, getting them to spit in their mouths, anything you can think of and these were with military subjects, 100% failure rate. They could not give the Spanish flu to healthy people via what you would call a normal transmission vector. Right. Dr. Alfred Hess and Dr. Sellers, they tried with measles and chickenpox. And, these are, obviously, these childhood viruses, so called, and they were unable to do it. What were considered the most infectious endemic diseases at the time. And, they even tried, I made just a quick note here about the polio. I know we're talking about bacteria today, but this specifically on Koch's postulates. They could not transmit the polio virus to orphans, unsuspecting orphans in New York City in the 1950s, by the way. So fails completely in viruses, and it also fails in bacteria. Couldn't do it with cholera, couldn't do it with tuberculosis. And you can even think back, why didn't the doctors in those sanatoriums, these sanatoriums that were just filled with tuberculosis patients back at the turn of the century, and why didn't the doctors and nurses get sick and get tuberculosis? Like they had N95 masks at the time, do you think? Anyway, so these are the two guys that are the fathers of germ theory, effectively. So
Okay.
Next we jump to,
if I can just summarize, like, you've got this invention of the idea. There are small things that we can't see, or we even can see. They've even observed the bacteria, and we say, oh, here's the small, scary-looking creature. That must be the cause. We'll do a whole bunch of tests to see if we can confirm it's the cause. They completely fail, and then still insist that these small creatures are causing disease.
Right. You'll see, and now here comes the alternative, and you'll have to start asking questions as to why this guy was ignored, and his contemporaries and the people that followed him, and why Koch and Pasteur were given credit for being correct. Right. That's the part that is hard to come to grips with. But our next guy is Antoine Béchamp. And he was another Frenchman. He was a contemporary of Pasteur, and Pasteur stole all kinds of ideas off of Béchamp. Béchamp was like the real scientist, right? Medical background. And he figured everything out, and he would publish it. And then Pasteur would wait a few years, and then Pasteur would come out and say, I figured this thing out. It was what Béchamp had published a couple of years earlier. He did this to him numerous times. And Béchamp wasn't interested in fame or popularity or money or anything. He was just a pure scientist. A lot of people will credit him, and I'm going to talk about terrain theory here in a little bit. Consider him the father of terrain theory. And basically what he would say was that the germ is nothing, the terrain is everything, is what he's famous for saying. So he was saying there's some sort of damage happened to the tissue, and once that damage happened, then the bacteria would come in to clean up or repair the damage. That was his basic idea. And that's the essential idea of terrain theorists today, is that you have damaged your terrain, your body somehow, with diet, toxin, pesticide, a food, lifestyle, whatever they think. And the bacteria are there to fix that damage.
Well, that's interesting that this idea was in the 1800s. So yes, even though I understand you don't fully agree with the terrain theory, the idea that bacteria was fixing damage is from the 1800s. And still, if you say it to someone today, they'll be like, that is ridiculous.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's
It's
right.
like they've never heard it before. It's an absurd idea.
That's what they'll
Hmm.
usually say. Have you never heard of bad bacteria? Which we'll talk about in a little bit. I have heard of
Okay.
them, but I don't believe in them. So anyway, he found this thing, this what he called the essential unit of life, and I'm going to play on that quite a bit here in this podcast. He called it a microzyma, and that just means small ferment. This little teeny tiny, for lack of a better expression, we're just going to call them dots. So he would see these little dots swimming around, and he was looking at with a light microscope. You can look at live tissue, unlike today's modern high technology, the electron microscope. We have to kill everything to see it, because you're just looking at these static, dead, stained slides of tissue. With a light microscope, you can actually look at living things happening, right? Metabolic processes happening under the microscope. So he was able to see these
Specifically,
little
this
things.
dark light microscope, right?
No, he didn't. He didn't have that. No, that doesn't come for
Oh,
quite a
okay.
while.
Okay. Sure.
He's just looking through the basic light, like the kind of microscope you would have had in biology class, or in high
Okay.
school or college or whatever. So he sees these little things swimming around, and he starts, checking them out. And he studied the blood and some other things. Really fascinating what he did. And he found over time that he could find these things not only like in a tissue sample or a blood sample of somebody, but he could actually find these on like rocks. He went into some caves that hadn't been visited for 10,000 years, and he found these limestone rocks, and he scraped off a little sample off the top of them, and he found these microzyma on them. And what he quickly found out was that these things were indestructible. In other words, you couldn't heat them too much. You couldn't burn them up, and you couldn't freeze them, and then they would die. They would always come back to life. So that's why he had called them this essential unit of life. And the key thing that he found, and of course he didn't make any pictures, he didn't have video at the time. This is 1870, 1880 timeframe. He found that these little dots, over time, if you watched them, would transform into different forms of bacteria. And excuse me. And these little particles, once they would turn into bacteria, and then they would do some sort of a job, whatever that job was, whether it was to eat something that shouldn't be there, remove something, or to help rebuild something. They would then transform back to the little dots that they were, the microzymas, when they were done being the bacteria.
It's pretty freaky
And
deaky.
right, very freaky deaky. And he found these in animals and plant cells all over the place. Like I said, on the limestone rocks, he basically said this was the beginning of what we today, which is heavily suppressed, not only the microzyma, but this idea of plemorphism or polymorphism. And people say it different ways, but it just means multiple forms or multiple shapes. So these microzymas would turn into all the different types of bacteria. So the tubercular bacteria looks like this, and the cholera bacteria looks like that, and and the staph bacteria looks like this. They just have different shapes, rods and ovals and commas, and they have all these little different shapes. And he was saying, that's just this microzyma turning into this shape to perform whatever role it had to perform.
Oh,
And
okay.
so
It's
that makes
interesting to
sense,
think of it like that, that it's kind of just taken on a different material configuration for the purpose of accomplishing a particular task,
right?
not so
Right.
much like a different life form that comes from a specific cellular programming, kind of thing.
Right. Exactly. So if you think about this, I always say, think of a bird or a squirrel that dies in your yard, and you don't do anything with it, you just leave it there. I guess the normal mainstream thinking is that there's bacteria everywhere, and they're just floating around, and they eventually float on down to the dead bird and
Right.
see it there, and then they go about their process of decomposing it. But this is not what Béchamp thought. And he said that these microzyma, right, when the flesh, the organism died and the flesh started to rot, the cells that were there, or the microzyma that were in there, would then transform into the bacteria that would decompose that flesh. They just clean it up, basically. Anything that's decayed or dead, their job is to eat it up. And that was his theory on what microbes and germs were for. So they aren't, he would say they are the result, not the cause of disease. Make sense?
Right. Yeah, well, he connected up to the main problem that I identify in medicine. And well, not just medicine, but like, I don't know, everything, which is that people are always looking at the symptoms and assigning them as the cause. Just
Right.
constant, just basic life operation. I see symptom, I say cause.
That's right. And get rid of the symptoms as fast as you can. Right. That's the goal of modern
Yeah, and therefore get rid of the
allopathic medicine.
symptoms quick. Like
How do we?
destroy them, take things to destroy them,
Right.
whatever you got to do.
In this
Cut them
case,
off
of
at the
course,
pass.
antibiotics, right, or against life, as the Latin
Right.
surmises. So those kill life. So take them, you kill the bacteria that were doing the work to restore your terrain, as Béchamp would have put it. So that's we'll talk about this again and again, but the rotting and putrefaction process is the bacteria eating away the dead, rotting flesh or material. And that's basically bacteria poop, for lack of better expression. And that's the thing that makes you sick, by the way. Talk about that in a little bit. So when they're breaking down rotting flesh, the excretion that they're creating when they do this decomposition is, poisonous, for lack of a better expression. Okay, that's not important. So hit last bullet here on Béchamp. He says, as the microzymas of the destroyed bacteria are also living, it follows that these microzymas are the living end of all cellular organization, which in turn into all living things, beings, organs, everything. They, the microzymas, are the end and the beginning of all physical life. All cells, organs, all living forms are built from these little bodies, microzyma. So
So I don't know if you wanted to mention it now, but it feels appropriate to me. Like this sounds like stem cells.
Yes, it does. Very much. And I'll talk about those a little
So,
bit here in the end. Go ahead.
so do you just want to leave it there that it sounds like stem cells, and then we'll just create the mystery now, and you'll resolve it later, or?
Yep. Yep. That's going to be part of
Okay.
my closing discussion.
Okay.
But
Well, I'll look forward to that.
my radical take is really Béchamp's radical take 150 years ago. But yeah,
Mhm.
we'll come to those here. We can talk about those. Let's keep it moving here to Gunther Enderlein, and he's 1872 to 1968. He was a German zoologist, entomologist, microbiologist, yada yada yada, and he really reified and solidified this idea of plemorphism. So he saw it many forms and shapes of microorganisms, first described by Béchamp. I don't know whether he knew about Béchamp's work or not. I don't know if that's true or not. I think he found it pretty much on his own. But he would said these little microorganisms were harmless, beneficial particles, and they're present in every animal or plant. He then would later say they may transform into larger pathogenic bacteria or fungi under certain circumstances. But again, he didn't have the big picture. He was just looking at these little things turning into other things. And he named them protits. That was his word. That was what Béchamp called microzymas. So again, these little dots swimming around, he called them protits. And I think he measured them. He said they were 1 to 10 nanometers in size. Small colloids of proteins is what he thought that they were. And he was convinced that these small particles were harmless and necessary for health. So this is going to be, let's call this the 1910 to 1920 timeframe. So okay. We have a different take, right, from Koch and Pasteur at this point from these two guys.
Right,
so
but two separate observations and seem to be pointing at the same phenomenon, right?
Well, it's two different assumptions or assertions, right? One says these little things are killing you, and the other one says they're essential for life. That's basically where we're at.
Oh, this Gunther Enderlein guy is saying they're. Wait, which one's saying they're killing? Out of Enderlein and
Koch and Pasteur.
But I mean, Enderlein and Béchamp, they're both saying taking the positive perspective, right?
Yeah, right.
Right. Those are
Harmless
the two observations I was talking about.
okay. We're going to keep going. There's more than just those two guys, right? We come to
Okay.
Royal Rife. Talked about Rife
Okay.
a lot in the virus podcast. He's in the 1920s and 30s when he's doing his amazing work. He builds his dark field microscope, and he sees these things too in his dark field microscope, and he calls them viruses because that was actually the definition of a microorganism smaller than a bacteria was called a virus in the 1920s. So that's what he called them. And a lot of people called them in that 1900 to 1940 range. They called these small things viruses, but they weren't defined then as they are now. So just a little trickery in there.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, he found some interesting, made some like frequency lasers that he could use to harmonize to kill certain bacteria and microorganisms. And he thought it was obviously doing, the medical world a great favor, and they thought so too, when he was helping people kill, cancer cells and other bacterial infections and so forth. He didn't understand that the bacteria were helpful. He was just following the mainstream ideas that were obviously promulgated from Pasteur and Koch that we needed to get rid of these little microorganisms. But I just wanted to include him here in that he saw these things as well. So now we got three guys that have seen these so far, right? Béchamp, Enderlein, Rife, and now we're jump straight into Wilhelm Reich. No time to tell his story. If you're familiar with him, he talked about this thing called the orgone, a massless, omnipresent substance that pervaded the universe, which kind of sounds like the luminiferous ether, if you will. And we've heard of this from all cultures and traditions going way back in time. Prana, Chi, Tao, Elan Vital, Vril, Odic Force. A lot of people have seen or suspected this was something. So that's his big claim to fame. But I just wanted to bring him up because he saw these little dots too. And unlike what the other guys called them, he called them bions. And I don't think he was familiar with the work of any of these other people, Rife, Enderlein, or Béchamp. And he said they were these microscopic units of the orgone that can organize into units of life. That was what he saw. So again, he's looking at these little teeny tiny, microscopic things. And he said they were self-luminescent and called them self-luminescent subcellular vesicles. And he could find them in decaying materials. So that's what he was looking at. And he said they were about 1 micron in size. And said they appeared as a transitional form between living and non-living substance. So he was watching decay, but he saw these things at work. And he didn't talk about the polymorphism so much. So he wasn't looking at that aspect, but he did see him. So we got a fourth guy now that talks
Is
about.
there just a little concern here if he said there were 1 micron, but other guy was saying they were 1 to 10 nanometers? Isn't that like 100 to 1,000 times different size?
Yep. Again, he saw them at a specific size. He didn't see them transform into smaller forms. So I think it was just based on his technology. Right? So remember, they can be as big as bacteria, which are much bigger than this. So they're shifting all through this range of sizes.
Is he suggesting that they're coming out of the ether or something like that they just materialize out of nowhere?
In a sense, yes. In a sense,
Okay.
but we won't go deep into him.
Don't get bogged down in that. Sure.
All these guys, a lot of these guys had their lives destroyed, by the way. Rife had his life destroyed. Reich had his life destroyed for bringing this information forward, and the powers that be not wanting their information to become popular.
Okay.
So, even Béchamp was never given any credit. So, and we'll see. Again, we get to our next guy here, which is Gaston Naissance, who was 1924 to 2018. So he died not too long ago. He was a French-Canadian guy. He lived in France at first, and he developed another dark field microscope, I think. And there are many in use today. Well, many, I don't want to say, maybe hundreds that some lab/scientific researchers have and use today. He called it a somatoscope. It was similar, obviously a lot more streamlined and technology had improved and, by the 1970s, 1980s when he was developing this. But he was able, again, what he's able to do with this is he's able to view living tissue and metabolic processes going on with life. Unlike everybody else who's using electron microscopes. And lo and
Mm-hmm.
behold, what does this guy find? He finds these little dots and he calls them somatids. So we've got bions, protits, viruses, microzymas, and now somatids. So we've got 5 different names for the same phenomenon, effectively. And he not only videoed, he not only sketched, but videoed what he says was the 17-form somatid bacteria cycle. And you can go online and find those drawings or videos today. Some of the videos are over on BitChute, I believe. And you can see how he would sit and watch. And Rife did this too, by the way. He would sit and watch for, 48, 72 hours at a time, just sit and watch these things change form. And just adding him here at the last, he was exiled in France for practicing medicine without a license, trying to help people with what he had learned about cancer. He moved to Quebec, Canada, continued his work. And, he helped a bunch of people who got, terminal cancer diagnoses, and, they lived because of what he gave them. And he got railroaded in court. He ended up prevailing in court, but I think it was a shot over his bow to, don't advertise this, don't talk about this, don't brag about this. So kind of lived out the rest of his life quietly, knowing that if word got out about his so-called cancer cure, then he would just be back in court and they would make his life miserable. So they destroyed his life in the same way that they destroyed Royal Rife's life. So we can see that whatever these men were doing, it was a threat to the establishment. Yes?
It's a fair call.
They did not want these men's work to become popular, to become known. And we'll have to surmise why here in a little bit, but could it be because that they were capitalizing on the fear that germ theory generates in human population? Would be my
What do you mean they were capitalizing on the fear? You mean the opposite of that?
The establishment
Oh, the
capitalizing
establishment was capitalizing on the fear. Sure.
Right. We're all scared to death of all these boogeyman viruses and bacteria. And of course, we need to take all their drugs and their treatments and do all the things that they say in order to avoid them. So big money, but more importantly, I think, is that it keeps us fearful. So here's my little, as I talk about some different ideas here, the crime scene tape idea is what I was explaining to you the other day. And this is the idea, and you could think of it as firemen at a house fire too, is that if you didn't know any better, like you just dropped in here from a UFO, you're an alien, and you come down and you see crime scene tape around an area, and people say, well, there's a crime here. You might begin to think that everywhere that there's crime scene tape, there was a crime. Therefore, crime scene tape means a crime is about to happen, right? It's like wasn't put there after the fact, right? It was put there before the fact, and then someone committed a crime inside of it. That's effectively what's happening with this germ theory, and especially around bacteria.
Well, I like the fireman at a fire one. Imagine that. Seeing the fireman at the fire all the time and being like, I'm pretty suspicious of these guys.
Right?
I see them here all the time.
Every time there's a house fire, there's these firemen standing around spraying water on it. And maybe they started in the first place. Right. That's the idea. That's what we have to believe that no one's been able to figure out in 150 years in bacteriology germ theory. They're blaming these bacteria because they're there at the scene of the crime, but they're there because they're fixing the terrain, if you will, repairing the terrain. And that was Béchamp's idea. So I think I talked about the failure rate of Koch's postulates. I wish I could say there's 3 studies out there that prove Koch's postulates, but they don't, even though that they say they do. In the first paper that came out of Wuhan for COVID, 2020, it says right in the title, literally, Koch's postulates were satisfied. They just say it. But you go and you read the paper and you read the method section, they didn't even try to satisfy Koch's postulates. There wasn't even an attempt, which, I don't know whether it's the boldness of these people that think they can get away with this, or the gullibility of the people reading the abstract. I don't know what it is, but they didn't do anything of the sort. And there's been guys back in the 1920s, there were a bunch of different guys, Powell, Fraser, White, or several different doctors who actually tried to infect themselves with all these different bacteria that they had at the time, and they all failed. They were like drinking bacteria daily.
Whoa, sounds
Right?
gross though.
Right. No, I mean, it's just, theoretically, you're drinking bacteria all the time too anyway, right? It's
Sure.
in all different kinds of products. They were just taking, tubercular bacteria or, cholera bacteria, whatever it was, measles, whatever they were trying to do, they were drinking it, and just all kinds of failures. So I think I did the spoiling leftover idea. So I'm going to jump past that. The good versus bad bacteria, right? This is this idea that we have built into, our daily mainstream lexicon, and that's, the probiotics idea, right? Where if I eat these certain yogurts and cultured food and sauerkraut and these other things, then it's going to help my gut bacteria, right? Which we all agree that there are good bacteria in your gut and they help you digest food, right?
Right. It's kind of like the bacteria that has been assigned the attribute good. Uh, that's the bacteria that it was like, well, okay, at this point, it's undeniable that this is helping. So
Right.
we'll actually say that's the good bacteria, but there's still the bad bacteria.
Right. Well, there's staph bacteria, staphylococcus and streptococcus, or whatever how they say it, strep and staph bacteria that are, it's in your body, it's in your throat, in your nose, and in your gut, and we all know
Mm-hmm.
that they're there, and they're normally good until they're bad,
Mm-hmm.
which is another strange idea, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here. But this is this idea that there are good bacteria, bad bacteria, and there are bacteria that are sometimes good and sometimes bad. And it starts to get real foggy when you start thinking of it this way. It's like, well, why would they be good and sometimes bad? And anyway, you can't make a lot of sense of it once you start thinking along the lines that I'm suggesting here in this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are infections? I get a lot of people. Well, how to explain an infection to me? And it's really simple. An infection occurs when something that doesn't belong in your body, in the sterile environment of your body or your bloodstream, needs to be removed. So it doesn't belong there. So when you're out riding your skateboard and you wreck and tear up your knees and your elbows, right? You grind in all the pavement and dirt and right rocks and who knows what else, right? It goes into your elbows and your hands and your knees and so forth. And if you don't clean it up and try to get all that stuff out of there, you're going to get an infection, right?
I guess so. So I'm told. I mean, I had a surgery when I was like 20 or something like that, and then the wound was suddenly like orange, like a little bit orange and pussing, and they said,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you got an infection. I'm like, okay, give me some antibiotics, but like, I don't know how it works really. I
Well,
saw that. I saw it. They said it's an infection. I don't know.
something was in your body that shouldn't have been there, right? Whatever it was, right? It was probably all the chemicals that they sterilized the surgical equipment with that got inside your body, right? That's
So you're saying the infection itself is just physical gunky matter that's not meant to be there, like gravel
anything.
or yeah, whatever, just anything, eh?
Right? Get a splinter. Get a splinter in your finger, right? And if
Oh
you
yeah,
if you
yeah.
don't get that splinter out, you're going to get an infection, right?
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, you do. Like when I was when you're a kid, you just get like a little splinter, and then you got like orange pus coming out of it. Is that
Yeah,
to suggest that some bacteria? But we, we initially think, oh, there must have been bad bacteria on the splinter, and it's gone into the
right,
body. That's the
right,
initial thought, right?
right.
So you're saying no, it's the splinter,
That's right.
not that there was bacteria on the splinter. Okay,
That's right. It's something inside your body that doesn't belong there.
right.
That's it. That's what an infection is. Something that
I mean,
doesn't
for me,
belong.
it could have even been the stitches, right? There's like
Yep,
stitches there. It's like, whoa,
that too.
these aren't meant to be here.
That's right. That is exactly right. So that's what an infection is. Now, when it comes to jabs and so forth, some people, this is some real bleeding edge theorizing, and I can't say whether it's true or not, but some people have suggested that any foreign DNA or RNA, so that's blood, tissue, fluids from another person or another being, another animal, are especially problematic and potentially damaging. So your body reacts violently when it detects DNA that isn't its own. And as most of us know who've studied this for a little bit, the vaccines contain all kinds of DNA from other creatures, monkeys, cows, human cancer cells, fetal cells from, aborted babies. I mean, it's a real mess. And think about that for a little bit on how that could cause any type of violent reaction, including infections. Because once again, they don't belong inside your body.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So some people will then run to the surgical masks and the sterilized equipment. You walk into a hospital and get anywhere near the, the surgical rooms, and it just smells like a chemical factory. They're just sterilizing everything everywhere constantly. And, there was an old study, I can't remember what year it's from, but maybe 100 years ago or so, that they did a study between maskless and masked, not 100, maybe 50 years ago, surgeons. And they just wanted to measure the rate. Say, let's do 100, surgeries where the surgeon doesn't have a mask and 100 where they do. And let's look at how many post-op infections we see. And it was actually the maskless had 0.4% fewer infections than the ones with the masks, which is statistically insignificant, of course, right? 0.4%.
So essentially the same.
It was identical. So there was no change. And of course, the theory for the mask is that there are bad bacteria in the surgeon's mouth, and if he sneezes, coughs, talks, wheezes, whatever, and some of that saliva gets into the body, then you're going to get an infection. That was the theory behind it. And it really stemmed from the older idea, which is that, this is back in the, 1800s when they figured out that you shouldn't be, on the battlefields, but that you shouldn't be cutting into, doing surgeries with the same knife that you were, equipment that you were using on the guy next door. Right. And this is more the foreign DNA thing than anything else. So, but that led to this idea that these knives were infected with deadly bacteria. And so they had to sterilize the surgical equipment. But I'm putting forth that it was more like, the bones and tissue and organ matter, right, that was on those knives was then introduced to the next guy. And that's what really caused the problem.
Right. So the belief imprint is that you would first cut the first person, then you take the knife out, and then you might set it aside, and it's got all this blood on it, right? And then the bacteria are like, woo, food. They're like on the table, and they're like, get all over this knife, and they're eating the blood, and they're like multiplying, and they're like, we're very bad bacteria, and now there's lots of us. And then you go put the knife in someone else, and now the bad bacteria is in them.
Right.
That's like the kind of belief that we are born into for this stuff, right? And you're saying no, it's just that it's foreign tissue and gunk.
In addition to that, in your example, remember what the bacteria do when they find dead, decayed flesh is that they eat it up, right? They decompose it, and so the bacteria poop is poisonous.
Okay,
right? That's like the anthrax is something like that, and salmonella and E. coli, right? This is bacteria poop is poisonous. So that could be that as well. If the knife sits on a table for 8 hours or 2 days or whatever, and they just reuse it and it's got the other guy's blood all over it, yeah, you got a problem there. But if they're just literally using it from one wounded soldier to the next, right, and he's just going down the line, and cutting this and cutting that, then he's spreading, and they're actually spreading the DNA of all them plus any decay that had gone on while that soldier was waiting to be operated on. So there could already be gangrenous dead tissue all over, right? And he's been out in the battlefield and he couldn't get into the, medical tents for 3 days or something. And yeah, that's some gross poisonous flesh that they're cutting into.
Right. I guess the main point here is that this phenomena, they're explainable without resorting to the bacteria.
That's right.
For blame, right?
You got it. So, all right. So jumping ahead, we go to the injections and vivisection, or what I call rodent torture. Sorry. So anybody who's in the medical field are going to immediately run to these scientific studies that are, there's thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands for all I know. They seem to enjoy doing this for some strange reason. But they're always doing these different tests on rats and guinea pigs and mice where they inject them with all kinds of things. And this proves the germ theory in their minds. And I just read them and I'm astonished that they draw the conclusions that they draw. Whatever they think they're testing, right? They take these, and I say, give me a box of Cheerios and some Coca-Cola and Cheese Whiz and throw it in a blender and throw some water in there and mix it up. And let's take, a couple cc's of that and squirt it into, the back of a mouse. You think the mouse is going to react well to that?
Right.
Or do you think you would react well to that? And you look at these studies and they're like, well, several of the mouse were sweaty and some lost their appetite and some weren't sleeping well and some lost weight. And so this is their proof. This is like half of their proof that there was an infectious bacterial agent or whatever in the syringe, is that these mice didn't react very well. And of course, the other half of their proof is that they found whatever they squirt in, they found tubercular bacteria in the lungs or kidneys or stomach of these mice, after they kill them, of course, and then do the autopsy, they find tubercular bacteria. Well, I bet you I could find the remnants of, Cheese Whiz or Cheerios in you if I squirt it into you, right? And then I kill you. Bet you I can find it somewhere in your body. So again, there is no surprise there. Not to mention that all these bacteria are produced. Well, I haven't gotten to that yet. But this is their proof that they think demonstrates that bacteria are pathogenic, contagious agents. And I know. What do you think? We've never talked about this before. Do you find that convincing that they can squirt these bacteria and other things in a syringe into these little helpless mice and they don't feel well and they don't sleep well or whatever? You find that convincing that these are disease-causing agents?
Just imagine someone did it to you, right? Like imagine someone keeps you in a cage and then comes along with a needle and stabs it in your back and like forces this like foreign stuff into you and you're like,
right.
Like you're not going to get sick.
Right. That's, and we haven't even talked about what really makes you sick. We're going to get into that in the next podcast. But the conditions of fear and anxiety and stress that these mice are in during this whole, sitting here watching your buddy next door to you getting stabbed by this monster, right? That's enough to cause death, as we'll soon see. But setting that all aside, none of this is even remotely convincing. So we simply say you've got to be able to, in order to prove the germ theory, the pathogenic germ, virus, bacteria, you've got to be able to prove that it causes disease through normal transmission vectors. I mean, you got to aerosolize it, put it in the water, put it on their food. You got to do something like that. And it's got to be real convincing that this is how it works. And to date, no such study exists.
Right. So, and it's interesting how without that convincing proof, people still believe it readily.
Yeah, it's the belief imprint, and there's no way all these guys could be wrong. And I'm not doubting that they do their tests and they squirt the mice and the mice get sick and, have loose stools and don't lose their appetite and can't sleep well and lose weight. I'm okay. I believe it, but that doesn't prove, right? That doesn't prove that it's the ABC bacteria or the XYZ virus, right? That causes these certain symptoms. They never get the symptom match. It's always, the thing didn't feel well afterwards, but you never get the wet cough or the dry cough, or this bacteria causes diarrhea and this one causes weight loss. There's never any correlation like that.
Right. Because you should be able to get perfect matching, right? If it's a legitimate causative phenomenon, you should 100% be able to go get whichever germ that causes whichever symptom. You should be able to get the germ, take lots of it, put it in an isolated little aerosol thing, spray it near another person, and then boom, it works. They get the germ. That's the Koch's postulate thing, right? That should be completely easy, and you should be able to do a simple experiment and lay it out in a couple of simply written pages. So if that exists, please send it to me. But I'm not seeing that anywhere.
Doesn't exist. And more importantly, then it should be repeated by other independent researchers, right? It shouldn't be one guy did it one time and this were his results. And so we all agree, right? It's like, I want to see your exact methodology, exactly how you did it, and we want to reproduce it. You get 5 different guys to reproduce the exact same thing. Now you got something, right? You got something provable. So let's dive into whatabouts. I'm going to zip right through these. We've really got to talk about a lot more things for these to be explained. But these are common bacterial diseases that everybody wants to know about, and a lot of them take some time to explain. I'm going to get into Dr. Hammer and Germana Schalkund in the next podcast. We're going to touch on it, but it takes time to talk about all these things. But first, I want to do pneumonia, and this is what Dr. Hammer considered one of his greatest discoveries. And it basically, for pneumonia, it's a combination of two different conflict shocks. And the first one is a scare fright conflict. And scare fright always hits the lungs and the bronchi. So basically what happens when you get scared or you're frightened is you move into shallow breathing, whatever it's about. And it's a real primitive predator prey kind of thing. Like when you're fearful, basically you're afraid you're going to die. And so you start breathing less, move as much, right? Your chest isn't moving up and down as much. And the body then widens your bronchial tubes during this period when you're scared. So when you get over that fear, then your body repairs that tissue. This is where the bacteria come in. And it's during this repair process that you feel sick. This is when you get the cough and you're wheezing and your snot and mucus and the whole 9 yards. And it's in this process that if you also, and Dr. Hummer called this really pneumonia, he called it more like a hospitalization conflict. It's an abandonment conflict, really what it is, or an existence conflict. And when you feel disoriented, abandoned, and not comfortable, right, not in your home, right, you're in this sterile hospital and your family's not around, that causes this. And what causes that is it causes water retention. So your body, it's like a fish out of water syndrome, like a fish getting flipped up onto the beach or whatever. And it causes the body to retain water. And this is very deadly when you have a lung problem or a scare fright conflict up in the lungs and the bronchi. And it can basically drown you. That's basically what pneumonia is. And all healing occurs in inflammation and fluids. And when that's exacerbated by an abandonment conflict, then it can be deadly. And that's what pneumonia is, according to Dr. Hammer. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that, explaining all those details, but that's the short answer for today's podcast. Now, there was a guy named Dr.
We'll go into
Mendelsohn.
more detail in the future, right?
Yeah, we'll do a lot more detail. You have to understand the whole thing that Dr. Hammer figured out before that really makes a lot of sense. But I just want to give it because there is an explanation. I wanted to add that there's a guy named Dr. Robert Mendelsohn wrote a book called Confessions of a Medical Heretic. And he wrote a few years before Dr. Hammer figured his stuff out. I think it was 1977. Really, really, really fascinating book. But he was just step by step, he was kind of just flaying the medical community for all its failures and what it's doing wrong. And one of his most important observations is that he said, no matter what, never leave a loved one alone in a hospital. And he didn't know why. He said, I don't know why this is happening, but the people who have their loved ones around them 24/7 have a much, much better outcome, right? They tend to survive. And the ones who don't tend to die. And I think what he was saying here is these people that were left alone felt abandoned. And whatever that abandonment conflict, whether it was a scare fright in the lungs or a different conflict, that anytime you have that abandonment conflict, it makes the existing thing they're going through much, much worse with that excess water retention.
Right. I mean, you're going to feel like your reason for living is going to be decreased, right? Because you thought that your family loves you, and then you look around, you're like, they're not even here. Well, what's the point of even living? You're going to get an abandonment conflict straight away, right?
That's part of it. But the more part of it is that you don't recognize anything, right? You're disoriented. You're on drugs that got you hopped up on who knows what, painkillers and this, that, and the other. And you're disoriented.
Right. So you're very, 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 very scared and confused and alone. And it's a horrible kind of anxious experience, right? Okay.
Yep. You're out of your element. That's really what it means. Fish out of water, or you're out of your element, which is your own bed, your own, kitchen, bathroom, etc. So that's pneumonia. Tuberculosis, zipping right through this, but this is the healing phase of a death fright conflict, according to Dr. Hammer. And it's interesting that there's a diagnosis called latent tuberculosis, latent TB. And they'll find tubercular bacteria in people that aren't sick, that have no symptoms whatsoever. And Dr. Hammer suggested that these tubercular bacteria were actually created during your death fright while lung cells are being proliferated. And when you get over your death fright conflict, then the tubercular bacteria are released to go and eat away the excess tissue in the lungs that were helping you get more oxygen. And it's during this time that you cough up and sneeze up and, sputum and so forth that is bloody and chunky and so forth. That's just the end result of the tubercular bacteria returning your lungs back to their normal state, homeostasis. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll zip through. Yeah, we're zipping. There's a lot to explain there, but that's just the highlight because people always want to know about that one. Stomach ulcers. A guy named Barry Marshall. I think he was from New Zealand, in fact. May have been Australia, but he's credited with being the co-discovery of the Helicobacter pylori bacteria, which is, as we've learned in this podcast, it's just a form, but this is what they gave the name to it. And this is back in the 70s, I think, maybe 80s. And he failed over and over and over again to infect all kinds of different animals with this bacteria that he found. Every one of his animal tests fails. And he's so sure of this that he starts taking it himself. And he thinks it's going to take a couple of years, by the way. He starts drinking this H. pylori bacteria. And within a couple of days, he starts getting these problems in his stomach. And this one man's discovery is why now people think that the H. pylori bacteria is an infectious agent that causes stomach ulcers. That's it. There's no backup studies. There's no, trials. There's no animal studies. It's this guy's one study where he got sick.
Okay,
so
sounds legit.
Yep. So this would indicate that, according to Dr. Hammer's work and Germana Shalkun, this would suggest that what he had ongoing was an anger conflict of some sort. So something he couldn't stomach. That's how GHK works. So he had a situation in life that he couldn't stomach. And so he was in the healing phase of that. And that's where there's pain. And that's where bacteria move in and repair something that they had done to widen or make the stomach more available to stomach a situation. So you can imagine he may have been angry that all his animal tests were failing for years. So it could have just been the perfect time. And I suggest you could probably grab 100 random people out the street and do the same test that Barry Marshall did. And a couple of them would probably have this kind of reaction. And these would be people who were dealing with active anger conflicts. Yeah.
Okay.
Lyme disease. Boy, that's a popular one, especially with middle-aged women. This is supposed to be the Borrelia burgdorferi bacteria. Again, just a form. According to GHK, this is a self-evaluation conflict, and it's also potentially separation conflict, skin rash. So that's where the tick comes in and you get a rash. That's a different type of a conflict, but there's no evidence that this is caused by a tick bite with this bacteria in his mouth. I mean, it really is none. And in fact, I think most people who get diagnosed with Lyme disease today never had the tick bite or remembered it. Of course, the doctor just as well. You may have never seen it. It have been on some part of your body you didn't look at, but a long way to go. And none of it's proven. Talked about anthrax. I think I talked about salmonella and E. coli, right? All these are just rotting flesh, food, spoiled. And that's what you're eating, the end result of the bacterial putrefaction. Quick story on my strep throat. I think Matt heard this one too many times, but I had strep like a dozen times when I was a kid. From like age 5 to 10. I'd get it 2 or 3 times a year sometimes. And, my mom didn't even bother taking me to the pediatrician. She had these throat cultures in the cabinet and she'd swab my throat, put it in an envelope and send it down to the state lab. And 24 hours later, yep, strep throat. I just go to the pediatrician. I couldn't swallow the horse pills back in the day. So I had to take the shot in the butt. It was just awful. Penicillin. But, this is one of the things that really convinced me, got me going on GHK was this idea. Their explanation is that there's something you couldn't swallow. And boy, was there something I couldn't swallow when I was a little kid. And that was vegetables. I hated almost every vegetable. And in order to get dessert, cereal, whatever it was, sometimes I had to eat my vegetables and I would make a big, giant scene about it, ridiculous scene about it. And I think that was... that was my body responding, say, oh, you can't swallow something. Let's widen your throat out a little bit to help you swallow better. And anyway, I'm pretty sure.
Right.
And just to add to that story, having it, none of my friends, parents, siblings, teachers, neighbors, nobody ever got strep throat around. I never knew anybody else who had strep throat. But how in God's name is it infectious?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, having this personal experience where you can notice that you've developed symptoms And you can identify, like you can feel it and notice it in your own life. Like you're like, oh, I can clearly connect that experience I'm having with this symptom. And also, I can see around me that there are no other people who are supposedly contagious with this thing. So I can just self experientially explain my symptoms. Just looking at your own life and searching for something like that goes a long way to understanding this kind of stuff. Because if you're just given the theory just rationally, it's hard to take in. You have to have that initial experience to really tie it in and go, oh yeah. So
Helps,
I would
right?
recommend it to anyone listening to like start looking at your own symptoms and try to explain it in a way that doesn't rely on a contagious invisible entity.
There you go. Could agree more. So yeah, so yeah, and that's how I came around to GHK. By the way, yeah, it was just me looking back at some of the few diseases that I had in my life and seeing if I could match up situations that in the weeks or months that led up to that disease. It's like I have a matching situation to what the explanation was. Anyway, we'll talk about that in the next podcast. That's worthy of probably a full hour. But what Dr. Hammer was suggesting is that bacteria are actually the microsurgeons of our body, and they perform tissue removal and restoration functions. But it depends on the tissue layer. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, any time on that. But either your body is proliferating tissue, like a tumor, or they're necrotizing or removing tissue to widen a tube, widen a passage, make something bigger or larger. And when you're done with your conflict, then this takes us back to Béchamp. The terrain is damaged somehow, and this is where I'm going to break and differ from the terrain theorist. It wasn't a toxin or wrong food or electricity or 5G that caused the terrain to change. It was this conflict process. We'll talk about that in great detail. But this is the idea here, is that I've mentioned it 3 or 4 times now, and this is the half truth of bacterial infections, in that when they're doing their work, and typically the body will knock you down so that it can do this tissue restoration or repair work, it will not make you feel out of energy, and the putrefaction does make you feel sick. So when the bacteria are doing their job for those 2, 3, 4 days, you do feel sick. So that's the half truth. Yep. When bacteria like this are active, you do feel sick. But they aren't the cause of the disease. Yeah.
Yep. Makes sense to me.
Right. So why do doctors think what they think? I get this one all the time, and I've said this in several of the podcasts. I'll repeat it here again. Is that they learned what they were taught. They didn't spend time there. No doctors, unless they're like a PhD in bacteriology or something, didn't spend their time trying to question or disprove what their textbooks were saying. They were under the assumption, rightfully so, that someone had already done all this work and figured it all out, and it was all said and done. So their job was to memorize things and learn them so that they could take them into their future practice as a physician.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is, when I have talked to several doctors, in recent years, and we go back to this. They have this blind belief in the efficacy of these standard rodent injection practices. They go, here's the paper. Like, you got to stop and think about this for a little bit, which is what I went over earlier, right? And some aren't willing to do that. Saying, no, this is the height of scientific, perfection. And if they say that this is the way it works, then I'm going to go with them. Nothing I can do at that point. But I don't put even an ounce of credibility into the rodent vivisection and torture practices. All right. We're here nearing the end, a little bit over an hour here. This is my hypothesis, and it's really not mine. This is really Béchamp's. I give him full credit, but I haven't heard people talking about it, so I feel like I've got to get it out there. I wanted to get this out there in the wild. And this goes to Matt talking about stem cells, right? Matt, what's your impression of what a stem cell is?
Well, I mean, only according to the theory that I've heard, your body is constantly creating stem cells, whatever they are, little pre-cells or something like that, and they can turn into whichever cell is appropriate for the situation that you're in, like the part of the body that they need to be used in or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's good enough. Basically, it's a stem cell is like you can produce a liver cell or a heart cell or a knee cell or a muscle cell or whatever. They all are supposed to be able to come from this originating stem cell. That's why they're so important, right? So the stem cells could be used to reproduce or repair a damaged kidney or a damaged gallbladder or a damaged testicle or whatever. That's the idea, is that they're the originating cells for all other cells.
So all cells were originally stem cells. That's the idea.
Yeah, more or
Not
less.
just sometimes, always.
Right. But and now so right, but where'd the cell come from, right? That's the next question. And that's where I'm taking this larger step and saying that the stem cells are the product of cooperating microzymas, somatids, bions, protids. Make sense?
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right.
That's what the stem cell is. It's just a bunch of these little dots that have gotten together to perform the symbiotic function to create life or a cell. And that's how it works. And when the thing finally dies, right, if you take the dead creature and you put it in this area where you will allow the bacteria to work and putrefaction, then eventually everything, all the flesh and tissue is gone, right? There's just bones and teeth or whatever. And there's like nothing left, but what's left are the microzyma somatids. That's what's left.
Right. So you're suggesting that these microzyma could become stem cells, or they could be and those stem cells could be used for, human cells, or they could become cells for bacteria.
That's right.
That's right. They could become bacteria.
That's right. They become all the living stuff that are in our bodies, all of it.
Okay.
Fungi, bacteria, and cells and tissue. And just to not put a finer point on it, this is according to the NIH, which I give almost zero credibility to, but I will just have to go with their numbers. I'm not going to count this anytime soon. They say 90% of the cells in the human body are bacterial, fungal, or otherwise non-human. Think about that for a second. 90% of you, what you think of as you, is not human. Right? So wait a minute. How is that? Does only microzymas create all this 90%? But what creates the other 10%? Oh, that's a special human stem cell. Yeah, it doesn't add up. I think it's all coming from one source, and it's this basic unit of life. It's the microzyma or the somatid. Yeah?
Well, it makes a lot of sense.
That's the radical take. Now, I wanted to just touch on Harold Hillman. Again, he was a British neurobiologist, 1930 to 2016. Really interesting guy. Did some fascinating stuff. And again, this is just another cautionary tale. Don't go against the mainstream and orthodoxy dogma, or you're going to have your career ruined and no one's going to back you, and you're not going to get any research money, and you're going to end up, working in a basement somewhere. But he basically, in a nutshell, tried to show, and he's got a lot of evidence to back it up, that most of the cell structures and organelles that we think of in the cell, and if you don't know your biology, then none of these will ring a big bell. But he said they were just air bubbles or staining artifacts. So we get these glorious diagrams of the ribosomes and the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus and all these things that make the cell go round. And that, by the way, the ER is a big part of how DNA and RNA are supposed to be transcribed. He says they're not even real. They're not even things. They're just images, air bubbles, artifacts. Now, he does say the nucleus and the mitochondria are real, and what's interesting is if you look at those closely, the mitochondria just look like little independent microzyma somatids, actually. There's more of them in a liver cell than in a lung cell, and it's different from cell to cell, but that's called the powerhouse of the cell, if you remember that from back in your day. And the nucleus kind of looks like multiple microzyma working together, if you can visualize it. Maybe there's 5 microzyma that are all playing the role of the nucleus. Anyway, food for thought. But the net is our body creates bacteria. We don't catch them from out there in the wild. You could walk through bacteria and breathe them up, or it could be in your milk or water, but you don't need to catch them to be healthy. I think that's another idea, is that if I eat these certain foods, if I, go to these certain places and play in the dirt and get dirty and put grass on my mouth, then it's a healthy thing for me to do, or the child to do, because that's giving them the bacteria that they need. I don't think that's right. I think, as laid out in this podcast, that the bacteria are produced by the microzyma somatid. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I was thinking is I'd love to actually have my own microscope and suss this out. So I would say if any listener, has what's the price of these things, like 100K or something like that?
I don't even know that they're any for sale. You mean like a somatoscope? I don't know
Like a
where you could
dark
get
field
one.
microscope or something, or just something, whatever
That's
you would need to observe these things.
yeah, that's a somatoscope. As far as I'm aware, that's everybody's using Nason's creation.
Right.
I don't
Well,
think
whatever it
Royal
is, like if you would like to see us observe this stuff and do reports on it, but then you just want to donate the money for that, then just go right ahead. We'll just get in touch and we'll
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 take a
sort out
look.
the equipment and we'll do it.
Yeah. Yep. I'm putting this out as a hypothesis and a theory, right? I don't know. I'm not a scientist in that sense. I have not looked at these things, but I think this is the most rational, sensible explanation that this microzyma somatid is the basis of all life. It's not the cell. The cell is not the basis. There's something
Hmm.
smaller. There's something that creates cells. And people,
Okay.
modern biology says cells come from other cells. It's like, okay, yeah, but where did the first cell come from, right? And if you really break it down, it's these tiny units that Antoine Béchamp figured out somehow or another back in 1870, whenever he, 1880, whenever he figured that out. So the cell is not the basis of life. It is this microzyma somatid, and its plemorphic nature allows it to turn into, as you said, bacteria, liver cell, brain cell, muscle cell, whatever you like.
Hmm.
So that's my theory. Putting it out there. I'm going to try to get a few people that I know to give me some criticism and feedback. I look forward to it. Like I said, I just want this idea to get out there and people to think about it a little bit. Could I be wrong? Of course, but I'm not seeing it at the moment. Why this doesn't make sense. So until someone does the microscopic work, the dark field, we may never know. So
Okay.
I wanted to add here in closing that if you've listened to our podcast, The Power of Words, we did that a few weeks ago, you'll note a powerful word being used to describe this mainstream explanation for infectious disease. And the word is theory, right? This whole thing with viruses and bacteria is called germ theory. And don't let the mainstream twist that around and like nothing could be ever proven scientifically, blah, 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 blah. It's not germ fact, is it?
Nope.
It's not germ law. It's germ theory for a reason. It's right there in front of you. But this is a theory and it's never been proven. In fact, a lot of people say today that it's actually been a widely refuted hypothesis for well over 100 years. Been refuted by many, many, many people. And they're just not given any credit. Their work is hidden, suppressed, rejected, so that we can continue to perpetuate the fear basis of germ theory. And dropping your fear of germs is a tremendous step toward taking your power back. What do you think, Matt? Crazy? Sense?
I think that if you believe in little invisible uh creatures with evil intent that are coming to get you and invading your body and making you sick, even though you've never seen them, then you're to some extent disempowered and you need to take your power back. I think that's a fair claim.
All right. Well, we've got a course for that. And
Well, it's
we
victim
don't,
consciousness, isn't it? I mean, like
um,
it's a this belief in these little microscopic things coming to get you is a projection of this victim consciousness. It's a belief in
yeah,
a cruel universe and that you're
right,
weak and that the outside is coming to get you and you're a victim of it and you need to somehow defend against it.
right.
The
Germ
alternative,
warfare,
yeah, it's the warfare, right? The
warfare
alternative
model,
just being like everything's fine. I'm fine, you're
right,
fine. Out there is
right,
fine.
right. So yeah, so this is going to be so I'm going to use these two podcasts about virus one and the bacteria one now to just I'll be saying forevermore that germ theory is not true. And if you need to go back, listen, these are the two to listen to. And I'm sure we'll get questions and pushback. And I look forward to all of those and critiques and look forward to responding to those as time allows. And we will. And we're just after the truth. We're not trying to fight for one side or the other. We just want to get after the bottom line. And from every bit of research I've done and all the details I can come up with, this is the only thing that makes sense. So there you have it.
Beautiful.
Radical take on bacteria.
Well, thanks a lot, Brad.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks everybody for listening. We appreciate your time. I think this went to about $1.15, but it was worth it to get it out of the way in one podcast. So we appreciate everybody listening, and we look forward to everyone's feedback. And we certainly look forward to everybody joining us on our next podcast, where we're going to talk about the cause of disease, which should be an interesting one.
Oh yeah, that's going to be grand. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great one.
Thanks everyone, and bye for now.